it seems like the tides are turning away from some of this, fundamentalist BS.
I agree.
So, yeah,
And it has to. I think that's where we're at. I think it has to. And I've seen this in the slavery debates.
Right.
And I feel comfortable saying that because I feel like I've been a part of many of them. There are just certain arguments that don't seem to come up anymore. I mean, they do come up rarely in some circles, but there's just some that, like, I don't hear a lot of people arguing that there wasn't slavery in the Hebrew Bible anymore. Sometimes it comes up, but ultimately they go, okay, so there was slavery, but God's using it, right? God's working through it. God's, condescending to man. But the arguments are having to sort of develop, and they're having to develop in a way that, I think hopefully will ultimately lead people to just go, this isn't really tenable.
Yeah. I mean, the issue again is like, so even if you punt to like God's permission, to condescend to a culture, like, isn't there a limit to like that kind of condescension? So like, so for example, I like to compare this, like rape, everyone knows rape is wrong. So something like that, could God, like obviously you could argue that there's like, rapey stuff in the Bible, but like, let's say hypothetically that God granted legal permission for people to rape. It's like, well, you'd automatically be like, no, a perfect being couldn't do that. It's like, okay, you have a clear understanding of the limits of this condescension over here. But then when you say, you get passages like, well, then why can't you apply that to granting legal permission to own human beings for life and pass them on as an inheritance?
Exactly.
I mean, why not? Why is there this, you're holding on so tightly to this when you can see so clearly that there's a limit over here? So that's the way that I look at some of that. I don't know if you want to, so we're on slavery now, so I don't know if you want to say, because that was another chapter, you probably just, it was probably essentially a brief outline of your whole book on the topic.
But it's, so I didn't want it to just be rehashing old stuff. So what I did in the chapter is I leave out most of the ancient Near Eastern stuff. And instead, so I give a brief overview of just slavery in the Hebrew Bible in general. I look very briefly at the three main legal passages, Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25. But then I have two new sections. One is looking at New Testament arguments, which was fun for me to put together because, again, it's outside of my strict field of expertise. But I feel qualified to write it. And, sort of looking, there's one main argument that I tend to hear the most, and that is that while God, as we were just saying, God sort of condescended to man and allowed man in the same way that, Matthew 19 talks about how God allowed the Israelites to put away their wives in divorce because of the hardness of their hearts, but it wasn't this way from the beginning. And so they sort of extrapolate that principle and apply it to slavery as well, even though there's nothing in the text that would do so. And my argument in that chapter is essentially, look, if that's happening, I would expect to see some sort of at least implicit condemnation of slavery. I certainly would not expect to see condoning or even endorsement of slavery in the New Testament. And that's what we see, right? So I go through some passages in the Gospels, go through some of the, I kind of go through, again, very broad strokes, some of the main passages that are used to try to say that the New Testament condemns slavery, like Galatians 3:28, there's neither slave nor free in the body of Christ, or First Timothy 1:10, where it talks about, slave traders, that's part of a vice list. Wicked people are the ones that do slave trade, and so God is condemning slavery, and that's not really what that passage is doing.
Right.
Of course, the book of Philemon, we talk about that in a couple of paragraphs. And then I do talk about something that comes up a little less often, but enough, and that is the parable of the talents, where the slaves are given talents, money, silver, most likely by their master, and given that to invest. And there's been this argument of late that at least I think Mike Winger might be the first person that I heard put it forward a couple of years ago, but that these are certainly, you don't give lots and lots of money to your slave and allow them to trade and invest while the master's gone. That doesn't sound like slavery. And so I address that, like, what is that that's going on? And then, talk about some of these other passages that, Jesus is using. He relies heavily on slavery, either as a metaphor,
right,
or, just as part of normal everyday life, even to his disciples, saying to them in Luke 17, which one of you having a slave, doing these things would say, so it's this idea of it's perfectly natural for you to normal. And then the last thing is, I talk about how the New Testament, the early church, how did they react to what they saw in the Old and New Testaments, and if the New Testament condemned slavery, people like Jennifer Glancy and Ronald Charles and others would, Hector Avalos would argue very strongly that they didn't know it. The early church didn't know that slavery had been condemned in the New Testament.
Well, it's interesting too, like, back in like the South, like a lot of the Reformed, people justifications of slavery and stuff like that, like considering the question of like whether there should be church discipline enacted against slave owners, the New Testament was primary. It wasn't just the Old Testament. Like, they laid out the case of like why they wouldn't discipline, why someone who owned slaves, in America would not be placed under church discipline. And the argument was like, obviously from the Old Testament to the New. And it's like, well, Paul didn't cast out slave owners from his congregations. Yeah. And this was Greco-Roman slavery, and it's not like sunshine and rainbows.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so he's basically like, their argument is like, well, we don't have the authority to do something Paul wasn't willing to do. So like Paul's not casting these, not in the church discipline is seen as something for unrepentant sin. So obviously, owning a slave is not an unrepentant sin, because Paul didn't cast these people out. So this was the kind of logic, and it's hard. Like, honestly, if you're looking at it through that context, I completely see why they would come to those conclusions. I mean, obviously I think slavery is terrible, but like, I don't think that there's as many resources in the Bible as people make it seem. Yeah. If you're, to make these kinds of jumps, because we progress morally in other ways that we read a lot of Western values back into the text that they're just not there.
And that's another thing that's very that's new about the chapter, and that is, I talk a little bit about the laws in the antebellum South, and what is it that the judges in the antebellum South, before the Revolutionary War and after, even I say especially after, what is it that they're wrestling with? And the legal rationale seems to be, and again, I'm not an expert in this at all, but you can read Thomas Morris's book on slave laws in the South. I can't remember the exact title, but he shows that what the judges were thinking, what they were writing about, what rights masters should have, what rights slaves should have in the antebellum South. And what they concluded sounds really similar to Exodus 21. So, just sort of a preview, I suppose, of it. Exodus 20-21 talks about if, a master beats his male or female slave, which was totally expected, with a wooden rod, and they die immediately, well, then, that master is to be punished. And the word there in the Hebrew probably means to be killed. Still debated, but it probably means to be killed. But verse 21, if he doesn't die, if he survives a day or two, or he dies a day or two later, it's a little debated what that means. But then there is no punishment, because he's his money, right? He's his silver, he's his property. And if you read through what the judges and the laws say, they say, well, I mean, no good Christian would abuse their slave in the antebellum South. That's no good Christian would do that. And if you murder a slave, I think it's Judge Ruffin that said, it is as if, the punishment is as if you killed a free white person. And you read that and you go, damn, okay. I mean, it's not good, right? It's not, because you could still have a slave, but it's a little unexpected given what we saw happening on the ground. But then follows it up with, but of course, slave masters have to be able to beat their slaves, with moderate physical correction. They have to be able to do that, because how else will you motivate the slave? And I mean, we see what happened, right? We saw, even though the laws in many ways are pretty similar, what you see in the Hebrew Bible, you see what happened. And so my argument, sort of in the end of the chapter, is look, we have to remember the past, or we are doomed to repeat it. And when I hear Christian apologists making these arguments, like, well, what's wrong with slavery in the Hebrew Bible? All right, yeah, there's slavery. What's wrong with it? Look, they couldn't just beat them to death. Like, okay, look, guy.
Right. Look at that's you know, just because you codify something in law or quote unquote doesn't mean that the practice on the ground is any. And
exactly.
Anyway,